I play both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. I also like to tank a lot in both of these games. So I thought it'd be a fun idea if I compared tanking in both FF14 and World of Warcraft. Despite being the same role, you'd be surprised at just how different they feel and play, so let's get started. The way this is going to be structured is I will go over how tanks feel in different scenarios, in particular raiding and dungeon environments. I won't be comparing how they're designed because these games are radically different, and FF14 only has 4 tanks versus WoW's 6. So first thing I want to go over is how they feel in AoE or dungeon scenarios. This one's going to be a bit tricky because WoW is propped up by Mythic Plus, while FF14 really only has Criterion dungeons, but it's new content, so there's only 1. So I'll be taking that into account during this part. That being said, I have many issues with Mythic Plus, but tanking is so much fun, and sometimes it is infuriating. You see, as a tank in M+, you are in charge of basically guiding the entire group. In order to effectively time your key, you're going to want to follow an optimal route to maximize your efficiency. Problem is, if you're in a group finder party, everyone has a different idea of what is optimal. So it's your job as tank to do the research ahead of the dungeon, and there are a lot of tools and really good videos out there to help, but this raises the barrier of entry for tank players pretty high, and personally, I'm not a big fan of it. Not to mention, some of these affixes are kind of dumb. I think the worst one is Storming, which I keep getting confused with Thundering on the beta. Blizzard! Despite that, if you do get into a good group, or you have your own dedicated team, tanking is great. There's so many opportunities for you to use your CC abilities, not to mention a lot of really cool tricks you can pull. My personal favorite tank to bring is Blood DK, only because Gorfien's Grasp is so satisfying. On the other hand, we have FF14 dungeon tanking, which is good. In general, I think the AoE rotations are simple but enjoyable. The standout for me AoE-wise is pre 6.3 Paladin, but I think the main difference here comes down to the dungeon design. You see, FF14 dungeons, Criterion included, are really more focused on those boss fights, versus WoW, where even with Tyrannical, there is a focus on the adds in between the bosses. In general, adds in 14 dungeons don't really matter and follow a set formula. You pop 2 to 3 mitigation abilities, maybe more, pull to the wall, and AoE them down. This changes in Criterion dungeons, but you're just pulling a bit slower, nothing crazy. There really isn't a lot of opportunities to use your CC tricks, not to mention there isn't a ton of unique CC abilities in the game. Still not bad, but it's not as engaging for me, at least when compared to WoW. This category in general is a tough one and kind of unfair to 14 because M+ has been out for like 6 years. But to the best of my knowledge, I prefer tanking dungeon scenarios in WoW. But I say this with the full knowledge that 14 will continue to add new Criterion dungeons, so keep this in mind because my opinion might change. Now, raid tanking is a different story. Raid tanking in World of Warcraft is actually pretty hit or miss for me. I'll be using 8.3's Nyalotha raid as my main source of reference because that's the last tier I main tank. So there are some really interesting tank mechanics. Keyword there is thumb. For example, I think Shadar is pretty interesting. It takes the idea of tank swapping and really makes you pay attention to the spell casts, because if you get hit by the same spell twice, you die. Meaning that in the sequence of 3 casts, the off tank will have the taunt off and maybe give aggro back to the main tank. I really enjoy any fight with adds when I'm tanking. Hivemind was a standout to me, but also I was playing Blood DK, which again, amazing. Then there are fights like Carapace and N'Zoth, where positioning is really important, which I absolutely adore. But on the other hand, you know what you're probably doing as a tank in WoW raids? You're gathering stacks of a debuff and then you're tank swapping. Now, this is also a thing in 14, but it is a lot worse than WoW in my opinion. I remember fighting Rodden, and your job as a tank was literally just stand there and taunt swap, at least in Heroic. I got to watch everyone else do all these interesting, cool mechanics, and I just kind of had to stand there. While there are some fights I really enjoy, a lot of the time I'm less interested in tanking when raiding. If the only thing I really have to do is stand there in DPS, okay, but the DPS rotations aren't that interesting. Contrast this with 14, and as mentioned, you do have those tank swaps, but there's more agency in deciding what to do with them. Some of them are shared, some of them are split. All tanks are given invuln, meaning you can decide if you want to use your invulns or do the fight like normal. That in itself is pretty interesting, but also the aforementioned problem of being left out of mechanics is non-existent. With 14 raids working like dance fights where you spend the entire time dodging or resolving mechanics, this in turn makes tanking more engaging by default. I know this one was kind of harsh in Warcraft, but I just think they could do better. And maybe I'm missing something. If something changed in the latest tier that I didn't cover, please let me know. But otherwise, in terms of rating, in my opinion, I think 14 tanks are better in raids. So that's 1 point for each of them. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. So now I bet both player bases are happy, right? Jokes aside, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.